Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and today we're going to talk about socialists in the mid-century America. The year prior to Upton Sinclair's loss in California, the U.S. elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt to office. For American socialists at the time, this was both a blessing and a curse. Roosevelt co-opted many socialist demands, halting any momentum for the Socialist Party of America, or American socialists more broadly, had gained since the turn of the century. The Democratic Party also offered to let socialists run for their party, like the aforementioned Sinclair. Roosevelt was not a socialist, either in the current definition or by the standards of the time. He reacted to a situation that unfettered capitalism had created. The complete lack of any controls on the stock market at the time allowed for a large number of scam companies to pop up, driving the stock market to unreasonable levels based on half-truths and outright lies. Roosevelt's policy forced reporting requirements and increased oversight on publicly traded companies without restricting actual unlawful companies to trade. This complete lack of bank controls led first to some banks failing. As people lost faith in the banks and tried to get their money out, they created bank runs, which drove otherwise solid banks out of business. Roosevelt's policies like the Glass-Steagall Act restored faith in the banking system, and specific programs like the FDIC brought millions of dollars back into the banking system. In addition to banking reforms, Roosevelt had a number of accomplishments over his 4 terms that changed life in America in ways that socialists could support. He funded 2 New Deal programs while cutting the military budget by over 30% in his first 2 years. He would also create the Social Security system, which compared to the Social Security systems in Western European countries was rather conservative, but for the time the federal government took responsibility for the economic security of the aged, temporarily unemployed, dependent children, and the handicapped. It's also interesting to note that his original intention was to make Social Security a universal program, but the 1935 Act excluded approximately 40% of the workforce, including farmers, domestic workers, and other groups. The same year, Senator Robert Wagner wrote the National Labor Relations Act, which guaranteed workers the right to collective bargaining through unions of their own choice. When the Flint, Michigan sit-down strike threatened the production of General Motors, Roosevelt broke with the precedent set by many former presidents and refused to intervene. The strike ultimately led to the unionization of both General Motors and its rivals in the American automobile industry. In the next 3 elections, Roosevelt could count on a strong backing by union laborers. In his second term, he passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, cementing many of the demands of the early 20th century socialists like Florence Kelley into law. It outlawed child labor, established a federal minimum wage, and required overtime pay for certain employees who work in excess of 40 hours per week. All things socialists had died fighting for in the previous decades, and all things we've come to see as normal today. In addition to providing a lot of sorely needed jobs, Roosevelt's works projects had lasting effects on the infrastructure, environment, and technological landscape of the U.S. But these were really stopgap measures to deal with a particular crisis. So, while he was an amazing president in many ways and did a lot to accomplish what had previously only been socialist goals, he was doing so as a way to further consolidate the power of the Democratic Party, but also to put enough bandages on capitalism to save it from the threat of an outright socialist revolution, electoral or otherwise. In his 1944 State of the Union address, Roosevelt advocated that Americans should think of basic economic rights as a second Bill of Rights. In it, he proposed a right to employment, food, clothing, and leisure with enough income to support them, freedom from unfair competition and monopolies, housing, medical care, Social Security, and education. Roosevelt proposed the GI Bill, which would create a massive program for returning soldiers with benefits including post-secondary education, medical care, unemployment insurance, job counseling, and low-cost loans for homes and businesses. The country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands, bold, persistent experimentation, he wrote. It's common sense to take out a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. The willingness to actually address, in some ways, the problems that capitalism had begun to manifest made him an unprecedentedly popular president, winning a total of 4 terms in office. This isn't to say it was all good, as he presided over some of America's most dire abuses of human life, like Japanese internment camps, the draft, or the development of the Manhattan Project. Still, while I am leaving out a lot of the less favorable of his actions, he still used his power as president to effectively pursue more socialist goals than any president before or after him, and his legacy has been deeply influential to many modern American socialists as well. None of this was to say that socialism effectively ended in America in 1933, replaced by a love for the Democrats and FDR's style of capitalism. Sidney Hillman was a Democratic socialist and leader of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, and had been critical in rallying the union workers to support FDR in his record 4 terms as president. Hillman became an influential advisor to FDR and Senator Robert Wagner, helping draft laws for workers' rights, including the National Labor Relations Act. Despite this, he still had aspirations outside of being a Democratic cheerleader, forming the American Workers' Party in 1935. Hillman's ACWA pioneered a version of social unionism in the 1920s and offered low-cost cooperative housing and unemployment insurance to union members, and founded a bank that would serve the labor union's interests. Hillman had strong ties to many progressive reformers such as Jane Addams and Clarence Darrow, who had assisted the Amalgamated in its early strikes in Chicago in 1910 and New York in 1913. In 1925, A. Philip Randolph organized and led the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first predominantly African-American labor union. In the early civil rights movement and the labor movement, Randolph was a voice that would not be silenced. His continuous agitation with the support of fellow labor rights activists against unfair labor practices in relation to people of color eventually led FDR to issue Executive Order 8802 in 1941, banning discrimination in the defense industry during World War II. The group then successfully pressured President Harry S. Truman to issue Executive Order 9981 in 1948, ending segregation in the armed services. This was also a time when the gay community would finally step forward into the socialist movement to advocate for their rights as well, with one of the very first being Haye Jr. He was a prominent American gay rights activist, communist, and labor advocate. He was a co-founder of the Mattachine Society, the first sustained gay rights group in the United States, as well as the Radical Fairies, a loosely affiliated gay spiritual movement. Bayard Rustin would be notable throughout the civil rights movement, fighting not only as a black man, but as a gay man as well. As a student of nonviolence under Randolph, he would go on to later see the civil rights movement with the philosophy of nonviolence. Rustin and Randolph would organize a successful March on Washington movement starting in 1941. This movement remained popular for over a year, with thousands of black Americans and their allies would predominantly flood Washington with activists. It was perhaps this exact political pressure that would cause FDR to consider an economic Bill of Rights only a year later. In 1949, Albert Einstein wrote an article for the magazine Monthly Review explaining his thoughts on socialism. In it, he explains his political positions and why he feels the need to weigh in on a subject that's outside of his area of expertise. Socialism is directed towards a socio-ethical end. Science, however, cannot create ends, and, even less, instill them in human beings. Science, at most, can supply the means by which we can attain certain ends. In the article, Einstein raises 3 major issues with capitalism. First, he says, man is at one and the same time a solitary being and a social being. Einstein goes on to say that capitalism pushes us to the excess of personal achievement at a great cost to the social collective. He also saw capitalism as wasteful and inefficient. There is no provision that all those able and willing to work will always be in a position to find employment. An army of unemployed almost always exists. The worker is in a constant state of fear of losing his job. Since unemployed and poorly paid workers do not provide a profitable market, the production of consumer goods is restricted, and great hardship is the consequence. Technological progress frequently results in more unemployment, rather than easing the burden of work for all. Lastly, he believes that the profit motive promotes cruelty for profit. The profit motive, in conjunction with the competition among capitalists, is responsible for an instability in the accumulation and utilization of capital, which leads to increasingly severe depressions. Unlimited competition leads to a huge waste of labor, and to that, crippling the social consciousness of the individuals which I mentioned before. I am convinced that there is only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy, accompanied by an educational system which would be oriented towards social goals. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society itself and utilized in a planned fashion. A planned economy, which adjusts production to the needs of the community, would distribute the work to be done among those who are able to work, and would guarantee a livelihood to every man, woman, and child. It may not surprise you that Martin Luther King Jr. thought of himself as a democratic socialist, and by the end of his life he was openly talking about the injustices that were inherent to capitalism. Of all the people on this list, he had the most followers and influence in America when he died. He's probably the figure on this list you know the most about, and because of that, you may have a mistaken understanding of what he was fighting for, especially in the years leading up to his assassination. As the first American to have a federal holiday honoring them without being a president, the first African American with a monument on the National Mall, and the sole American venerated as the martyr of the 20th century at Westminster Abbey, King's legacy endures. His legacy, however, is often sanitized, manipulated, and even warped to support the narrative others want to tell. King was expressing his opposition to capitalism as early as 1952. In a letter written to his wife that year, he noted that, "I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic." Over a decade later, in a speech to the Negro American Labor Council in 1965, King declared that something is wrong with capitalism, and suggested that there must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move towards a democratic socialism. His concern for the poor was unflinching, and came to greater prominence in his activism towards the end of his life. In his final speech to the Southern Christian Leadership Council, he said, "Why are there 40 million poor people in America?" When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. He was also supported in his efforts by numerous socialists like Bayard Rustin, who organized freedom rides, and helped to organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to strengthen King's leadership. He also passed along what he learned about nonviolence from A. Philip Randolph, and would later serve as an organizer for a new March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom alongside Randolph in 1963. It was this iteration of the March on Washington that King would deliver his most famous speech, in which he both promoted the nonviolence of the organizers, Randolph and Rustin.
We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. They have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone.
And while neither the words socialism or capitalism appear in the speech, this didn't stop King from incorporating economic language into the speech, even on a metaphorical level.
In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital, such a step. And the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. They were signing a promissory note, which every American was to full heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check. A check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check A check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice.
King also had a specific number of solutions to the problems he saw America and the world facing. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly, by now a widely discussed measure: the guaranteed income. Like other 20th century socialists before him, he was also in direct opposition to the current war, which for him was Vietnam. When King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, he was in the middle of the Poor People's Campaign, which was focused on economic inequality and demanded an economic Bill of Rights from Congress. The Poor People's Campaign asked the federal government to prioritize helping the poor with a $30 billion anti-poverty package that included, among other demands, a commitment to full employment, a guaranteed annual income measure, and more low-income housing. The Poor People's Campaign was intended to be a part of the second phase of the civil rights movement. King said, "We believe that the highest patriotism demands the ending of the war and the opening of a bloodless war to the final victory over racism and poverty." King wanted to bring poor people to Washington, D.C., forcing politicians to see them and think about their needs. "We need to come in mule carts and old trucks and any transportation people can get their hands on. People ought to come to Washington, sit down if necessary in the middle of the street and say, 'We are here, we are poor, we don't have any money, and you made us this way, and we've come to stay until you do something about it.'" It was likely because of this campaign and the real threat that it posed to the moneyed interests in charge of American policymaking that he was assassinated. The proposal wasn't entirely new. It echoed the Economic Bill of Rights suggested in 1944 by FDR, whose death in 1945 prevented him from being able to put the proposal into action. But many of the promises lived on in the Poor People's Campaign before its leader, too, met a sudden and early end. That's far from the end of socialism in America, though. And there are arguably more influential socialists and anarchists today than ever before, so the sky really is the limit if we can come together. Obviously, we have an uphill battle in the fight for progress, but this always has and always will be the case for socialists. We only pick uphill battles, because this is the nature of socialism. We will always, by this nature, push the boundaries of society closer and closer to utopia. At the end of this project, some commonalities are clear. Socialists had a strong sense of morals for their time, even when compared to their progressive contemporaries. Time and time again, the passage of years will transform any radical socialist cause into common sense. Socialists oppose war pretty consistently and have a strong connection with organized labor. Caring about workers and humane working conditions, they were the first to call out slavery and the first to call for universal suffrage. Once those goals were achieved, the movement shifted to improving labor standards and quality of life for workers, calling for many aspects of working life that we find invaluable today, even though much of what they fought for now has eroded. Socialists in the 20th century have called for the expansion of human rights, perhaps best summed up in FDR's 1944 proposal of an economic Bill of Rights and crystallized in Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign. The 20th century not only changed the goals of socialists after the victories of the 1800s, and through their continued successes. It changed our lives in ways that are appreciable even now. As a summation of these ideas, I leave you with MLK's last sermon, The Problem of Poverty, as presented by content creator Matt Orfila.
There must be something positive and massive in order to get rid of all of the effects of racism and the tragedies of racial injustice. And that is another thing closely related to racism that I would like to mention as another challenge. We are challenged to rid our nation and the world of poverty. Like a monstrous octopus, poverty spreads its nagging, prehensile tentacles into hamlets and villages all over our world. How can one avoid being depressed when he sees with his own eyes evidences of millions of people going to bed hungry at night? How can one avoid being depressed when he sees with his own eyes God's children sleeping on the sidewalks at night. Maybe we spend far too much of our national budget establishing military bases around the world, rather than bases of genuine concern and understanding. And I must confess that in some situations, I have literally found myself crying. I was in Newark and Harlem just this week. This welfare mother pointed out her little boy who was a victim of lead poisoning. She pointed out the walls with all of the ceiling falling through. She showed me the holes where the rats came in. She said night after night we have to stay awake, keep the rats and the roaches from getting to the children. This can happen to America, the richest nation in the world. This is America's opportunity to help bridge the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. There's nothing new about poverty. What is new is that we now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. And the real question is whether we have the will.
If you are still watching the video at this point, I'd like to take the time to ask you to check out the following channels, which, like my own, have not reached 1,000 subscribers yet. And if you're not subscribed to this channel, hit that button, ring that bell, do the YouTube stuff. And in an effort to keep this channel ad-free into the future, I would also ask that if you appreciate the content I'm putting out here, that you could go over to my Patreon, or even for a one-time donation, my Ko-fi page, and send me a little bit of money to help me make ends meet in a year that has been troubling the hell out of everyone.